I was just the backup plan for my troubled brother, until I finally escaped, and then, growing up, I always felt like the extra piece in a puzzle that was already finished. My name is Sarah, and for as long as I can remember, I was the forgotten child in a family that revolved entirely around my older brother Ryan. He was 5 years older than me, and from the moment I entered the world, it was like I'd upset some balance he had carefully crafted for himself. Ryan has ADHD, and while I now understand that it can make life difficult, as a kid all I saw was how everything in our home revolved around him, and how no one seemed to care how it affected me. It started early. My parents, Linda and Frank, would always tell stories about how Ryan threw tantrums when I was a baby because I was getting too much attention. I wasn't old enough to remember, but my mom would laugh about it like it was something cute. Ryan just didn't like sharing us, she'd say with a smile, like it was some sweet anecdote to cherish. To me, it never sounded funny. It sounded like a warning. When I was about 4, I noticed it for myself. Ryan didn't just dislike me, he resented me. If I was playing with a toy, he'd snatch it away. Not because he wanted to play with it, but because I was enjoying something and he couldn't stand that. I'd cry, of course, because what 4-year-old wouldn't? But my parents would just shake their heads and say, Ryan doesn't mean it. He's just overwhelmed. Be patient with him. That word, patient, was drilled into me over and over again, as though I was the problem for not being understanding enough. The worst days were my birthdays. For most kids, birthdays are something magical, a day that's all about them. Not for me. Every year, Ryan made sure the day was ruined. My 7th birthday was one I'll never forget. I had a small group of friends over, and we were about to cut the cake when Ryan stormed into the room. He'd been sulking all morning because the attention wasn't on him, and as I stood next to my cake, smiling for the camera, he shoved the table so hard that the cake toppled to the floor. My friends stared in shock. I stared at the mess of frosting and candles smeared across the carpet. Ryan didn't even look guilty. He just crossed his arms and glared at me like I had forced him to do it. My parents? They rushed to calm him down. Ryan, it's okay. We'll get you some ice cream, my mom said, pulling him aside as though he were the victim. I didn't even get a chance to cry before my dad started cleaning up the cake and telling me, Don't be upset, Sarah. You know how Ryan gets. I didn't get another cake that year. My friends left early, and I spent the rest of the day in my room. That was the day I realized something important. My feelings didn't matter. Not to my parents, not in our house. If I cried or spoke up, I was being dramatic. If Ryan acted out, he was just overwhelmed. I stopped expecting anything different after that. As I got older, Ryan's behavior only got worse. By the time I was 9 and he was 14, he had grown stronger, meaner, and more aggressive. It wasn't just about stealing my toys anymore. He'd shove me if I was in his way. He'd knock things out of my hands. My homework, my lunch, anything, just to remind me he could. Once, I was holding a drawing I'd spent hours working on for art class. Ryan snatched it, crumpled it up, and tossed it in the trash. When I told my mom what happened, she didn't even look up from what she was doing. He's just being a big brother, she said. You'll understand when you're older. I remember standing there, holding back tears and thinking, what exactly was I supposed to understand? That my brother had free rein to treat me like garbage, and I just had to accept it? It wasn't just Ryan's actions that hurt. It was the way my parents dismissed me every single time. If Ryan hit me, they'd comfort him for losing his temper. If I screamed in frustration, they'd tell me I was overreacting. I'd cry in my room at night, wondering if maybe they were right. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I was the problem. But deep down, I knew the truth. Ryan was a bully, and my parents let him be. The most vivid memory I have from those years came when I was 10. I had been working for weeks on a science fair project. It was my first time feeling proud of something, and when my teacher told me I might win, I was over the moon. I told my parents that night at dinner, hoping for some praise, but Ryan wasn't having it. No one cares about your stupid project, he muttered. I tried to ignore him, but I saw the look in his eyes, the same look he always had when he was about to ruin something for me. That night, I left my project on the kitchen table. The next morning, it was gone, completely destroyed. The poster was ripped to pieces. The model I'd built was smashed. I found Ryan in the living room, watching TV like nothing had happened. Why would you do that? I yelled at him, tears streaming down my face. He just smirked and shrugged. My mom came into the room, saw the mess, and immediately turned to me. Sarah, don't yell at your brother. You know how easily he gets upset. Upset? I was the one crying. I was the one who'd spent weeks on that project, and now it was in ruins. But as always, Ryan's feelings came first. My parents didn't punish him. They didn't even tell him he was wrong. Instead, my mom handed me some paper towels and told me to clean up the mess. By the time I turned 12, I stopped asking my parents for help. It was easier to keep my head down and stay out of Ryan's way than to hope they'd ever take my side. I became quiet, withdrawn. My friends noticed and asked why I never invited them over anymore. But what was I supposed to say? That my brother hated me? That my parents didn't care? I couldn't explain it, so I just said I didn't feel like it. Even at school, where I should have felt free, I carried the weight of it with me. Teachers would compliment me on being well-behaved or mature for my age, but that wasn't really true. I wasn't mature. I was just used to being invisible. I learned to shrink myself down, to take up as little space as possible, because that's what life with Ryan had taught me to do. At 12 years old, I didn't know how to put it into words, but I felt like I was drowning. I longed for a normal family, one where siblings fought sometimes but still loved each other. I wanted parents who saw me, who noticed when I was struggling. Instead, I got Ryan, the center of the universe, and parents who made me feel like a shadow. I didn't know it then, but those feelings, those years of being invisible, were slowly shaping who I would become. And they were also planting the first seeds of my escape. By the time I turned 13, I stopped hoping for things to change. My brother Ryan was now 18, and with his size and age, his bullying had become harder to avoid and even more frightening. It wasn't just the shoving or the snide comments anymore. Now it was deliberate, calculated, and always delivered with a smug grin, like he knew no one would hold him accountable. My parents still refused to see what was right in front of them, choosing instead to coddle him and excuse every single thing he did. I can still remember one day in particular, right before I started high school. I was sitting at the dining room table working on a summer project. I had carefully arranged my papers and notes when Ryan walked by, grabbed the edge of the table, and accidentally knocked everything onto the floor. My hands froze midair as I stared at my crumpled work scattered across the ground. He smiled that smug, infuriating smile and said, "Oops, you shouldn't have put it there." I snapped, yelling, "Why do you always do this?" Ryan just laughed and walked out of the room like nothing happened. I was still picking up the pieces when my mom came in, saw me kneeling on the floor, and immediately sighed like I was the problem. "Sarah, don't be so dramatic. I'm sure it wasn't on purpose. You know how Ryan can be." That line. I heard it so many times it still echoes in my head to this day. Ryan didn't just torment me at home. He struggled at school, too, though my parents would never admit it. He was always getting into trouble, talking back to teachers, refusing to do his work, picking fights with other kids. But no matter what Ryan did, my parents always made excuses for him. "Ryan's trying his best," my dad would say whenever they got a call home from the principal. "He just needs extra patience." Ryan didn't have many friends. My parents often tried to force friendships by arranging playdates or inviting kids over, but it never went well. I remember one afternoon when I was about 14, my mom brought over one of her coworkers' sons, a quiet kid named Josh who was supposed to get along with Ryan. It was a disaster. Ryan made fun of him for being shy, then threw a basketball at his face hard enough to make his nose bleed. Josh left in tears, and my mom spent the rest of the evening apologizing to Ryan. "You didn't mean it," she kept telling him. "It's okay. You just got frustrated." She didn't even acknowledge the hurt he caused, and that was how it always went. Meanwhile, I learned to shrink myself down even further. I stayed in my room most of the time, reading books or listening to music with my headphones on, trying to escape the noise and chaos that came with living in Ryan's shadow. I became the quiet kid at school, the one who never caused problems or made waves. My teachers praised me for being mature, but I knew better. I wasn't mature. I was exhausted. I didn't know how to be a kid because my whole life had been about keeping the peace. At this point, I stopped trying to talk to my parents about how Ryan treated me. They never took me seriously anyway. One evening, when I was 15, Ryan and I were watching TV in the living room. I grabbed the remote to change the channel, and he yanked it out of my hands so forcefully that he shoved me off the couch. My head hit the corner of the coffee table. I remember lying on the floor, dazed and in pain, while Ryan just sat back and smirked. When I told my mom about it later, she didn't even look up from her phone. "You need to stop provoking him," she said. "You know how Ryan gets." That night, I cried quietly into my pillow, feeling completely alone. I started to realize that my parents weren't just blind to what Ryan was doing. They had chosen not to see it. They didn't want to deal with the truth, so they let me suffer instead. One of the worst moments happened when I was 16. It was supposed to be a good day. My history teacher had nominated me for a state academic award after months of hard work, and I was so proud of myself. I came home and told my parents, hoping for just a tiny bit of praise or acknowledgement. My mom smiled distractedly and said, "That's nice, Sarah," before turning her attention back to Ryan, who was complaining about how unfair his teachers were. Ryan didn't say anything right away, but I noticed him watching me all evening. Later that night, he barged into my room uninvited. "Why do you always have to act like you're so perfect?" he sneered. I didn't even know what to say, so I stayed quiet. He grabbed the certificate I'd left on my desk, tore it in half, and dropped it at my feet before walking out. When I told my dad the next morning, he just shook his head and said, "You know Ryan's going through a hard time. Don't take it personally." How was I not supposed to take it personally? Ryan had ruined something I had worked so hard for, and my dad acted like I was the unreasonable one. That moment hit me harder than any shove or insult Ryan had ever thrown my way because I realized my parents would never defend me, no matter what he did. They had decided that Ryan was the priority, and I was just collateral damage. By this point, my grandparents were the only people I could talk to. My mom's parents, Evelyn and George, were kind and patient in a way my own parents never were. I started visiting them more often, escaping the house for a few hours at a time, just so I could breathe. My grandma would sit with me at the kitchen table, handing me tea and listening as I poured out everything that had been building up inside me. She never interrupted, never dismissed me. She just listened. One day, after I told her about Ryan tearing up my award, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You don't deserve this, Sarah," she said softly. "You're not wrong for wanting more." Those words stayed with me. I wasn't wrong for wanting more. I wasn't wrong for feeling hurt, for wanting to be seen. For years, I'd been made to feel like I was the problem, like I was too sensitive or selfish for wanting my parents to care about me as much as they cared about Ryan. But my grandma's words gave me a small sliver of hope. I started to dream about a future where I could leave it all behind. A future where I didn't have to walk on eggshells in my own house, or make myself smaller to keep the peace. I didn't know how I would get there yet, but I promised myself one thing. I wouldn't spend my whole life feeling like this. I was going to get out. Somehow. Some way. And for the first time in years, I started to believe it might actually be possible. By the time I turned 17, the resentment I felt toward my family was like a weight I carried everywhere. It wasn't just Ryan anymore. His bullying had become so normalized that I expected it, but my parents' refusal to acknowledge it had cemented something in me. I had spent my entire life being invisible, the afterthought in a house that revolved around my brother, and I was done pretending that I could handle it. I needed to leave. It wasn't just a wish anymore. It was survival. I knew I had to get far away. I couldn't just move across town or go to a local college where my parents could guilt me into coming home every weekend to help with Ryan. No, I needed a clean break, somewhere they couldn't pull me back in. So I started planning my escape like it was a military operation. Every night, after finishing my homework, I sat at my desk researching colleges, specifically ones far from our small town in Missouri. I looked at universities in states like California, New York, and even Oregon. I needed distance, miles of it, to finally breathe. I didn't tell my parents what I was doing. I couldn't risk them interfering. They would never understand why I wanted to leave, and they certainly wouldn't support it. It didn't take long for my parents to notice I was spending a lot of time in my room. One evening, my dad knocked on my door and poked his head in. "You've been quiet lately," he said, like it was something unusual. "I've just been busy with school," I said, keeping my tone even. I didn't want to give him any reason to start asking questions. He gave me a long look, the kind that made me feel like he could see right through me, but then he shrugged and walked away. I breathed a sigh of relief. As far as my parents were concerned, I was the good kid, the one they didn't have to worry about. I had worked hard to keep it that way because being ignored was better than being scrutinized. I threw myself into my schoolwork, determined to get the grades I needed for a scholarship. My family didn't have much money to begin with, and I knew my parents wouldn't help me pay for college, not after I told them I wanted to leave. I started working a part-time job at a local diner after school, saving every penny I could. It wasn't much, but it was mine. A few months later, when I had gathered enough information, I started applying to schools. My heart pounded every time I hit submit on an application. This was it. My ticket out. My escape. I didn't know if I would get accepted anywhere, but I had to try. Eventually, the night came when I couldn't keep my plans a secret anymore. We were sitting at the dinner table, my mom, my dad, Ryan, and me. Ryan had been complaining for the past 10 minutes about how his teachers hated him because they were making him redo a project he hadn't bothered to finish. My parents nodded sympathetically, as always, telling him, "They just don't understand how you learn." I stared down at my plate, trying to block out their voices, when my dad suddenly turned to me. "Sarah, you're awfully quiet. What's going on with you?" For a second, I froze. I hadn't planned to bring it up yet, but something in me snapped. I was tired of keeping it a secret. "I've been applying to colleges," I said, trying to sound casual. "Out of state." The room went silent. My mom's fork clattered against her plate. Ryan looked up from his phone, staring at me like I just said I was moving to the moon. "Out of state," my mom repeated, her voice sharp. "Why would you want to go so far away?" I kept my eyes on my plate. "I just think it would be good for me. I want to experience something new." My dad's face darkened. "What's wrong with staying here? There are great schools close to home." I took a deep breath, bracing myself for what was coming. I need to get away. I need space." My dad's expression hardened. "Space? Space from what?" Before I could answer, Ryan cut in with a sneer. "She just wants to act like she's better than us." "That's not true." I shot back, my voice rising despite myself. "I just want to live my own life for once." That's when my dad said something I'll never forget. He put down his fork, leaned forward and said, "You know Ryan needs you here. You can't just leave him like that. We've always counted on you to help with him." I stared at him, my stomach twisting into knots. "What do you mean, counted on me?" My dad looked at me like I was being difficult. "Sarah, we've talked about this before. Ryan struggles, and he's going to need you as he gets older. That's just the way it is. You're part of the family plan." Family plan. Those words hung in the air like a cloud of smoke, choking me. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My whole life, I had felt like I didn't matter, like I was nothing more than a shadow in Ryan's spotlight. Now, my dad was telling me out loud what I had suspected for years. I wasn't a person to them. I was a backup plan, a safety net for Ryan. My mom must have realized how much damage my dad's words had done because she quickly tried to smooth it over. "That's not what he meant," she said, her voice shaky. "Of course we love you. We need you to think about what's best for the family." I couldn't look at either of them. I felt like I was going to be sick. "I'm not responsible for Ryan," I said quietly. "I need to live my own life." Ryan rolled his eyes. "Selfish much?" I pushed my chair back and stood up. "I'm not selfish," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "I'm just done pretending that my life doesn't matter." I left the table without another word, my parents calling after me, but I didn't care. I went upstairs, shut my door, and sat on my bed, trying to process what had just happened. My dad's words echoed in my head. Family plan. It was like my whole life had been laid out for me without my consent. I wasn't Sarah, their daughter. I was Ryan's future caretaker. That night, I made a promise to myself. I didn't care what my parents said, and I didn't care how hard it was going to be. I was going to leave that house, that town, and everything that came with it. I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life cleaning up after Ryan. I wasn't going to let my family's expectations define me anymore. This was my life, and for the first time, I was going to fight for it. The months that followed were a blur of determination and exhaustion. I poured everything I had into my schoolwork and my part-time job at the diner. I needed good grades for scholarships, and I needed to save every dollar I could. My escape plan became an obsession. I stayed up late studying, applied for every scholarship I could find, and worked long shifts after school. My parents barely noticed. They were too busy dealing with Ryan. He was 18 now, and though he'd technically graduated high school, he wasn't doing anything with his life. My parents covered for him constantly, brushing off his lack of direction and blaming it on his ADHD. He just needs time to figure things out, my mom would say whenever anyone asked. Meanwhile, I was doing everything I could to ensure I didn't end up like him, stuck in our small town, suffocated by excuses and false hope. By winter, acceptance letters started rolling in. I remember the first one vividly. I was standing in the kitchen, staring at the envelope in my trembling hands. The return address read, University of Oregon. I had applied to schools all across the country, but this one was nearly 2,000 miles away. It was everything I had hoped for. I opened the envelope, my heart pounding, and there it was. Congratulations! I had gotten in. I felt like I could finally breathe for the first time in years. I held the letter like it was made of gold, because in a way, it was. It was my freedom. I didn't tell my parents right away. I was terrified of how they would react. I waited until after dinner one night, when the house was quiet, to drop the news. Mom, Dad, I said, standing at the doorway of the living room, where they were watching TV. I got accepted to a university. My mom smiled absently. That's great, honey. Which one? The University of Oregon, I said, my voice steady. I'm going to move out there for school. The room went still. My dad muted the TV and turned to look at me, his face unreadable. Oregon? That's across the country. I know, I said. That's where I want to go. My mom's smile faltered. But why would you go that far? There are perfectly good schools here in Missouri. We can't afford out-of-state tuition. I've applied for scholarships, I said quickly, and I've been saving up. I can make it work. My dad shook his head. Sarah, this is ridiculous. You don't need to go that far just to get a degree. Think about Ryan. You know how much he relies on you. There it was again. Ryan. It was always about Ryan. He doesn't rely on me, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. You rely on me to deal with him. My dad's expression hardened. You're being selfish. Ryan's going through a hard time, and you want to run away? What kind of sister does that? A sister who's tired, I snapped. A sister who's been ignored for her entire life because of him. Sarah, my mom said, shocked, like I just cursed at them. I couldn't hold it in anymore. You've spent my whole life making excuses for him. He's mean, he's cruel, and you act like it's my job to put up with it. It's not. I deserve to have a life, too. I deserve to matter. My dad looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't know what to say. My mom started crying. We've always done our best for you. How can you say that? I shook my head, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. If this is your best, then it's not enough. I'm going, and you can't stop me. I left the room before they could respond. Upstairs, I sat on my bed and let the tears fall. I didn't want to feel guilty for wanting more, but it was hard not to. My whole life, I had been made to feel like my needs were an inconvenience, like wanting to be seen was selfish. But for once, I wasn't backing down. The next morning, my parents tried a different approach. My mom sat down next to me at the kitchen table, her voice soft. Sarah, we're just worried about you. Moving so far away. It's a big decision. I know, I said, but I need to do this. What about us? She asked, her voice trembling. What about Ryan? I looked at her and said the words I had been holding in for years. I'm not responsible for Ryan. I never was. She looked stunned, like the idea had never even occurred to her. My dad wasn't as gentle. That evening, he cornered me in the hallway. If you leave, don't expect us to help you, he said. You're on your own. I met his gaze and said, I've always been on my own. The next few months were hard. My parents stopped talking to me unless they had to, and Ryan made my life a nightmare. He went out of his way to antagonize me, almost like he knew he was losing control over me. One night, he blocked my bedroom door. towering over me with a smirk on his face. "You think you're better than us, don't you?" he said. "I think I deserve better." I shot back. I pushed past him, my heart pounding, but I didn't let him see how scared I was. He didn't get to win anymore. As graduation approached, I packed my things in secret. I didn't want Ryan to destroy anything, or my parents to try and stop me. My grandparents, Evelyn and George, were my lifeline during those months. They let me store some of my bags at their house and promised to help me with the move. "You're doing the right thing, Sarah," my grandpa told me one afternoon as I sat at their kitchen table. "It's not wrong to want more for yourself." The day I left was quiet. I had already arranged to stay with my grandparents for the summer before heading to Oregon. My parents barely said goodbye. My mom hugged me stiffly, tears streaming down her face, but she didn't say a word. My dad didn't even look at me. Ryan didn't bother coming out of his room. I should have felt sad, but I didn't. As I loaded my bags into my grandpa's car, I felt free. For the first time in my life, I was choosing myself. That summer, I worked harder than I ever had before, saving up every dollar I could. My grandparents were incredible, letting me stay rent-free and even helping me with some of the costs of my first semester. They told me how proud they were of me, and for once, I believed it. When the day finally came to leave for Oregon, I stood at the airport gate with my grandpa beside me. He gave me one of his signature pep talks before I boarded. "You've got a whole life ahead of you, Sarah," he said, his voice steady and warm. "Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't deserve it." I hugged him tightly, tears stinging my eyes. "Thank you," I whispered. As I boarded the plane and looked out the window at the ground below, I felt a mix of fear and excitement. I didn't know what waited for me in Oregon, but I knew one thing for certain. I was never going back to that house, to that life. For the first time, my future felt like it belonged to me, and that was enough. Arriving in Oregon felt like stepping onto another planet. Everything about it was different. The air, the people, the city skyline. I had spent so long dreaming of leaving that it didn't feel real when I finally did. For the first few days, I walked around the campus in a daze, overwhelmed by how far I was from everything I'd ever known. But despite the excitement, it wasn't easy. I had no safety net. My parents hadn't given me a dime, and I couldn't rely on them even if I wanted to. I knew from the moment I left home that I was truly on my own. My grandparents had helped me get here, and I owed them everything, but I wasn't about to ask them for more than they'd already given. I found a job at a small diner near campus, waiting tables and working the late-night shifts that no one else wanted. I was taking a full course load and working 30 hours a week just to keep a roof over my head and buy the textbooks I needed. There were nights I came back to my tiny dorm room so exhausted I could barely move, but it didn't matter. It was mine. My life, my choices, my freedom. The hardest part was realizing how unprepared I was for the real world. I'd spent my entire childhood walking on eggshells, trying to survive life with Ryan and my parents. I had never learned how to manage money, cook for myself, or ask for help when I needed it. I felt like a little kid in a room, full of adults who already had their lives together. The other students around me seemed so carefree. They talked about going home for the holidays, calling their parents for advice, or getting help when they were short on cash. I didn't have any of that. At first, I felt like I didn't belong. I wasn't the smartest student in the room, and I wasn't the most put together. My clothes were secondhand, my textbooks had coffee stains, and I never had enough time to study as much as I wanted to. But what I did have was determination. I had spent years being invisible, years being told I was second to someone else's needs. I wasn't about to give up now. Slowly, I started to find my rhythm. I made a few close friends, people who didn't know about my past and didn't expect me to carry the weight of someone else's problems. They liked me for who I was, and that was new for me. One friend, Claire, would sit with me in the dining hall between classes, laughing and talking about everything and nothing. She didn't realize how much those little moments meant to me. For the first time in my life, I felt seen. Still, at night, when everything was quiet, I couldn't help but think about home. I wondered if my parents missed me, if Ryan even noticed I was gone. There were days when the silence hurt more than I wanted to admit. I thought about calling my parents sometimes, just to see if they'd pick up. But then I remembered how they had ignored me for years and how they let Ryan make my life miserable. The first few months went by quickly, and eventually, winter break arrived. While other students packed their bags to go home, I stayed on campus. I didn't have anywhere to go. My grandparents called to check on me, and I reassured them I was fine, even though I spent most of that break feeling lonelier than I ever had. I worked extra shifts at the diner to distract myself, and when the new semester started, I threw myself back into my studies. Slowly but surely, things began to change. I started to feel proud of myself. Each time I aced a test or got through another grueling double shift, it felt like a victory. Every dollar I saved and every paper I turned in on time was proof that I could survive on my own. Over time, I stopped wondering if my parents would ever call. I stopped waiting for an apology that would never come. It hurt to admit it, but they had made their choice when I left. They had chosen Ryan, and I had chosen myself. It wasn't until nearly a year later that I heard anything about what was happening back home. I got a call from my grandma one evening. She never called unless it was important, so I knew something was up. "Sarah, your parents are having a rough time," she said gently. "Ryan's been acting out worse than ever." "What happened?" I asked, even though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. My grandma sighed. "Apparently, he's been causing trouble in the neighborhood. Your parents finally got a wake-up call when the police got involved. Ryan had been yelling at some kids, throwing things at them. One of the parents called the police, and he was arrested." I was stunned. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me felt relief, like maybe, finally, my parents would see that Ryan's behavior wasn't something they could keep ignoring. But another part of me felt sad. Ryan had spent his whole life acting like the world owed him something, and now it had finally caught up to him. "What did my parents do?" I asked. "They bailed him out, of course," my grandma said. "But the court ordered him to start therapy. Your parents are struggling to pay for it. Your mom mentioned it to me the other day, and I think they're hoping to reach out to you soon." My stomach dropped. I hadn't spoken to my parents in over a year. I didn't want to hear from them, and I definitely didn't want to be dragged back into their mess. "What did you tell her?" I asked. "I told her not to expect you to fix everything," my grandma said firmly. "You've done enough, Sarah. It's not your responsibility." Her words brought tears to my eyes. She understood what my parents never did. I had spent my entire life being patient, being the good kid, carrying burdens that weren't mine to carry. I wasn't going to do it anymore. A few days later, I got the call I had been dreading. My dad's number popped up on my phone screen, and for a second, I almost didn't answer. But against my better judgment, I picked up. "Hello?" I said, my voice cautious. "Sarah, it's Dad," he said. His voice sounded older, more tired than I remembered. "How are you?" I didn't know how to answer that question coming from him. "I'm fine," I said flatly. "What do you want?" He sighed like he was disappointed in me. "Your mom and we've been talking. We think it's time we put everything behind us. We miss you, Sarah. We want to make things right." I stayed silent, waiting for the real reason he was calling. "And sure enough," he continued, "the truth is, Ryan's struggling. He's been in trouble, and we're trying to get him the help he needs, but it's expensive. We thought maybe, since you're doing well now, you could pitch in a little, just until we get back on our feet." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. After all this time, after ignoring me for years, they were only reaching out because they wanted something from me. I gripped the phone tightly and said, "No, Sarah, come on," he said. "You know how hard this has been for us." "I don't care," I snapped. "I'm not responsible for Ryan, and I'm not going to save you from the mess you created. You chose to ignore everything he did, and now you're dealing with the consequences. That's not my problem." I hung up before he could say anything else. My hands were shaking, but I felt lighter than I had in years. For once, I had stood my ground. That night, my mom sent me a long text message full of apologies and promises to do better. But I didn't respond. I had spent my entire childhood waiting for them to change, and they never had. I wasn't going to fall for it now. I wasn't angry anymore. I was free.